Hey everybody, and welcome back to my channel. Well, as you probably noticed, last week there wasn't a video, and there was a reason for that. I actually shot a short film based on an original screenplay I wrote, and it's called Transgender Whiplash. In the film, I switch between my boy self and my girl self to kind of highlight the challenges I faced during my transition. I'm very excited about it, and I hope to show it at Bufferfest up in Toronto at the end of September. So fingers crossed it gets accepted, but even if it doesn't, I will submit it to other film festivals, and I will post it eventually to my channel. So stay tuned for that. Also, in the last week, there's been quite a lot said about President Trump's ban of transgender people in the military here in the US. Now, I had considered maybe saying something about that in this week's video, but to be honest, I've written so much about it on my Facebook and other social media that I really don't have a lot more to say. I am in the process of writing an article though, and I'll put a link below to my watermark author page just in case any of you want to read it. But today I wanted to talk about something uplifting instead. And seeing as how today is July 29th, it is also the anniversary of the day I came out. Now, I've already created my coming out video, so I'm not going to talk about that specifically, but I do want to talk a little bit about the first time I ever went out as Maya. And I haven't done a story time with Maya segment in quite a long time, so I thought you guys might enjoy that. So way back in January of 2011, I had just gotten to Florida after my divorce, and I had moved in with my mom, which as you can imagine was pretty humiliating for somebody who was nearly 40. But at that time, I really didn't have anywhere else to go. And back then, I really had a mix of what I would call boy clothes and girl clothes, because I really hadn't made the full transition at that point. I was actually very embarrassed to wear any of my girl clothes. I still remember putting on a bra and then a t-shirt and walking around the house in like the first few days I was here and having my mom just like stare a hole in me, which made me incredibly self-conscious and embarrassed. So I took the bra off and then I took a picture of myself, which only actually caused more embarrassment because my ex-wife and my cousin both pointed out that it was really easy to see my nipples. So after 4 days of just kind of lounging around the house, I decided I had given up so much to make it to this point already that it seemed really silly not to do what it is that I really wanted to do, which is go out as Maya. I mean, I needed to honor the sacrifices I'd made up to that point. The question then became, how and when was I going to do that? Well, I wasn't nearly brave enough yet or confident enough to go out into public in broad daylight. What I decided to do was go to a movie at night at some place where I thought maybe I could be a little inconspicuous. So at the time, there was a movie playing at the theater in downtown Disney called Black Swan. And I figured maybe if I went to the last show of the night, which was at 10:30 at night, I wouldn't encounter too many people and certainly not any kids because, you know, God knows they should be in bed by then, right? I could just sneak into the movie theater, watch it, and then sneak out again and nobody would be the wiser. And since the movie was rated R, I figured I wouldn't run into many children. As I said before, that was actually a key factor in all this. Why? Because, well, children can be actually really brutal because they're very, very honest and they basically don't have any filter. Transgender people know that if you walk down a block and you run into a kid and maybe your gender presentation isn't quite as seamless as it could be, you're gonna hear about it. You know, kids are gonna point you out maybe to their parents and say, Mommy, why is that man dressed that way? Or why is that woman dressed that way? It can be very, very embarrassing. So my nightmare scenario is actually to run into one of these kids so early on in my transition and have me get pointed out to one of their parents and maybe have their parent not react so well to me. In preparation on that first night, you know, I did my makeup really well and I put on some feminine clothes, but I was still very self-conscious about wearing what I thought of as women's clothes back then. So I just put on like a nice top and some jeans and some clearly ladies shoes. And then I drove off to downtown Disney for like the 10:30 showing of Black Swan. And then when I got there, I just kind of sat in a car in the parking lot because I was just petrified to walk out of that door and into the great unknown. This was my like very, very first time out in my new home as Maya. Cross-dressing, or at least what I thought of as cross-dressing back then, wasn't something I did very often and never went out in public to do. But this was it. This was the real deal. The day Maya was going to become public. I got out of my car and started walking towards the theater, and wouldn't you know it, first thing I saw, 10:30 at night. I don't know what this kid was doing up, but it is Disney. And it was this young girl, and I saw her walking towards me, and I literally like froze in my tracks. So scared out of my mind, I didn't know what to do. And I remember looking at her, and then she finally looked up and locked eyes with me with complete disinterest and walked right by me. I was, needless to say, completely shocked. I really didn't know how to take that, but except to exhale a big sigh of relief and continue on to the movie theater. And then when I got to the movie theater, I suddenly was faced with a dilemma because I also didn't know what I sounded like. Because it's one thing to look like any other woman, it's another thing to sound like any other woman. And transgender women will tell you that may be the hardest thing to do is construct a believably feminine voice when you've lived 40 years as a guy. And I had zero confidence that I could pull it off. So instead of going up to the box office, I decided to just get my ticket from one of those little electronic ordering kiosks. So I forced myself to go inside the theater, and And then I gave my ticket to a young man who was collecting them, and he looked at me and he smiled. Of course, in my mind, I kept going over, did he figure out that I was actually a transgender woman, or was he just being nice? And I had, of course, just about zero experience with men back then. I was starting to feel exhilarated because nobody was really paying attention to me, and even that young guy didn't react in any way negatively. So I just went straight to my theater and then sat down way in the back in the dark and watched this incredibly artistic movie with all kinds of sexual topics. That Natalie Portman Mila Kunis scene right in the middle of that movie, whew, was that hot. Foreshadowing for my future life. Towards the end of the movie, I realized I really needed to go to the bathroom. And I hadn't really thought that far ahead, and I was nowhere near ready to walk into a ladies' room. But I figured one big obstacle a day to overcome was probably enough, and I didn't go to the ladies, I just went home. When I got home that night, I used my laptop camera to make a little video journal of my experience that night. A lot of people saw me, and nobody seemed to care or notice, so that was really good. So yeah, I looked a lot different back then, a lot different. Over the next few days, I would try out my Maya presentation as often as I could in different venues to see how far I could push the envelope. I remember going to Target and having to return an item and just having the lady behind the desk kind of just smile. And I remember thinking to myself, she knows who I am. But I also realized that even if she did, she was still really nice to me, and it didn't seem to matter to her. And then the last thing I did was actually take a pretty big chance, which I wouldn't recommend to anybody. Sometimes I wonder if I was actually really brave back then or just really stupid. What I did was I got dressed and went to church that Sunday. And my sister had told me what time services start, and it turned out that that wasn't the time at all. Again, I wanted to be as inconspicuous as possible and just kind of sneak into the back and sit down and watch the service and then leave at the end. But when I walked in, the service was already going on and everybody was already seated. So I just kind of stood up against the back wall watching things and just kind of getting the lay of the land. Unfortunately, I also caught the eye of the ushers. And they went, ma'am, do you want to sit down? You want to sit down? Here, sit over here. And they made an entire row get up. And I was dying that entire walk. I felt like a million years for me to get over to where I could sit down. And that happened to be next to a very young boy and what looked like his father. And this part is pretty sad, but I remember thinking to myself, if that man knows that I'm transgender, he might not take very kindly to me sitting next to his very young boy. There's definitely a little bit of an element of danger to the entire thing. And we as trans women know that we are always taking our lives into our hands when we go out as our authentic selves. And when I got home, I thought to myself, wow, I have gone out for 4 days in a row and I haven't attracted any attention at all. And in that moment, I realized I never ever had to go back to being him again. I could just stay as Maya for the rest of my life. So I put away all my boy clothes in a drawer and then later on gave them to some trans guy friends that I had. And I also set aside my old life and became this person that you see now. Anyway, I hope you liked this story time with Maya, and feel free to leave me some comments below to let me know what you think about it. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and see you around the interwebs.